The pilgrim road to the shrine of Ardenvale was crowded that morning, packed with merchants, travelers, petitioners, and the usual assortment of desperate souls who made the 3-day walk each autumn to beg whatever gods still listened for another season of mercy. Oliver Walker had no interest in mercy from gods. He had his pack, his longbow slung across his back, a belt knife worn smooth at the handle from years of use, and a contract from Lord Harwick that paid him 40 silver marks to escort a surveying party safely to the shrine and back. The surveying party had dissolved 2 days north, when bandits hit their camp and scattered every scholar and mapmaker into the woods like startled geese. Oliver had collected one scratched surveyor and delivered him to the weighhouse at Crossmoor, pocketed half his fee, and turned back south alone. The other half of the contract waited at Harwick's Hall. He meant to collect it. The road was narrow here where it squeezed between the old shrine walls and a moss-covered bluff, and the crowd thickened into something close to a press. Travelers shuffled, elbowed, muttered curses, and did what people always did when they moved in crowds. They parted around obstacles without thinking, the way water finds channels around stone. Oliver watched it happen without fully registering it at first. The crowd was splitting. Not the casual drift of people giving each other room, but something sharper, something that smelled of fear. A deliberate, sharp opening of bodies, people pressing their backs against the shrine wall, stepping into each other, clutching their packs to their chests and looking elsewhere. He noticed the gap forming ahead of him, 20 feet of cleared road where no one wanted to stand, and then he saw why. She was enormous. That was the first and most honest thing about her, and Oliver let himself see it plainly without the flinch everyone else seemed unable to suppress. Ugak Strongtusk stood 6 feet and 4 inches of muscle and intent, moving down the center of the pilgrim road with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never in her life been uncertain that she could handle whatever came next. She was orc, unmistakably, the deep green of her skin the shade of pine shadow in late afternoon, her lower tusks rising from her jaw in 2 clean ivory curves that caught the pale morning light, her eyes a sharp, burning amber that swept the crowd with the practiced calculation of a warrior reading a battlefield. Her black hair was braided in a single rope that fell over one shoulder, bound at the tip with a wrap of dark red cord. She wore travel-worn warrior's leathers, a fitted bodice of oiled dark brown leather that laced up the front with bone toggles, shaped close to her body, and cut at the waist to show the cinched line of a broad belt studded with small iron rings, close-fitted riding trousers of heavy leather that followed the muscle of her thighs, and tucked into knee-high boots with iron-capped toes, and a short pauldron of overlapping steel plates on her left shoulder, fastened with a wide strap across her chest that also served as the anchor for the massive, double-headed axe strapped across her back. She was striking in a way that made Oliver's chest do something he chose not to examine too closely, the kind of woman who looked as though she had been built to stand in the middle of a road exactly like this and own every inch of it. The crowd gave way. Every single person stepped aside. They did it without being asked, without discussion, driven by some animal instinct that recognized a predator and wanted very much to be somewhere else. Merchants sucked in their bellies against the shrine wall. A pair of pilgrims in prayer-white cloaks stumbled over each other to clear the center of the path. A large man driving a handcart actually lifted it out of her way, which was, Oliver thought, an impressive feat of adrenaline-fueled effort. Oliver did not step aside. He was not certain why in the moment. Later he would tell himself it was stubbornness or fatigue or simply that he had spent 11 years as a huntsman in Harwick's deep forest and had learned a long time ago that the thing that looks most dangerous is usually less dangerous than what is hiding in the undergrowth. But the honest truth, the one he would eventually admit to Ugak herself, was that something in the way the crowd parted made him feel a deep and instinctive reluctance to join it. He had been the man people stepped around his whole life, overlooked, unremarkable, left to the edges of rooms and conversations, and watching this woman get the same treatment, even if it came from fear rather than dismissal, made him unwilling to add his body to the wall of avoidance. So he held his place in the center of the road and looked at her, and she looked at him, and for the span of 3 heartbeats neither of them moved. Up close she was even more striking. There were old, healed scars along her jawline, and one thin white line above her left brow. Her hands were enormous and scarred across the knuckles, and she held them loose at her sides, not reaching for the axe but not pretending it wasn't there either. She was perhaps 28 or 30, he guessed young for a warrior of her evident experience, old enough that her eyes held something harder than youth. She stopped 2 feet from him. The crowd held its breath. "You should move," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with the slight rolling cadence of someone who had learned common tongue as a second language and then used it long enough to wear the accent smooth. It was not a threat. It was closer to advice. "So should everyone else," Oliver said. "They managed anyway." He glanced at the wall of people pressed against the shrine stones. "I'm not usually the tallest thing in a room. It is nice for a change." Ugak stared at him. He could see her working through what he had just said, looking for the mockery or the angle, finding neither. "You are in my path," she said. "I am on the road," Oliver said. "Last I checked it belonged to the pilgrims. Are you on pilgrimage?" "No, neither am I, so we have equal claim to the center of it." He held out his hand. "Oliver Walker, Lord Harwick's huntsman, currently between contracts, heading south." She looked at his hand for a long moment. The crowd was absolutely silent. Someone's mule shifted its weight and the sound was absurdly loud. She shook his hand. Her grip was careful. She was obviously aware of what she could do to someone's hand if she was not, and her palm was dry and warm and calloused in ways that told him volumes about how she used it. "Ugak Strongtusk," she said, "warrior of the Greyveil clans, not on pilgrimage. Where are you headed?" "South, Harwick, if it is any of your business." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "That is where I am headed. And given what the road looks like right now, I would say traveling together might be safer for both of us." Ugak Strongtusk looked at him with an expression he could not read. Then she looked at the crowd still pressed against the shrine wall, still watching them with wide eyes, and something shifted in her face, not softness, not yet, but a crack in the iron surface, just a hairline fracture. She turned back to him. "You are not afraid of me," she said, not a question, not entirely a compliment, more like someone reading a map and noting an unexpected landmark. "Not particularly," Oliver said honestly. "Should I be? Most men are. Most men have never spent a winter in Harwick's deep wood, where the bears are bigger than you and considerably less reasonable." He adjusted the pack on his shoulders. "I can track, hunt, navigate, and I know every wayhouse and watering point on this road for the next 60 miles. The road through the Calvin Narrows is crawling with Breakbone Company bandits right now. They hit the surveying party I was guiding 2 days north of here, scattered them like sparrows." He paused. "You probably don't need my help with bandits. But I know where the safe camps are, and I know which wayhouse keepers are honest and which ones water the ale and charge triple for anything that doesn't look entirely human." The last sentence landed. He saw it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the small, involuntary acknowledgement that this was a problem she had encountered before. "You are saying you are useful," Ugak said. "I am saying we are going the same direction," Oliver replied, "and neither of us wants to share the road with every frightened pilgrim between here and Harwick's gates. Company makes both of us less of a target, whatever people think the reason is." Another long pause. The mule shifted again. A shrine bell rang somewhere above them, thin and silver, and the crowd began to exhale and unstiffen, the tension bleeding slowly out of the moment now that it was clear no one was going to die. "Fine," Ugak said. "Walk then." She turned south. Oliver fell into step beside her, which required him to lengthen his stride slightly, and the road opened before them with the same automatic parting that had opened it for her alone. The difference was that now people glanced between them with a new species of confusion, the kind that comes from seeing something that doesn't fit any category you have already built. Oliver noticed it and said nothing. He just walked. They made 4 miles before either of them spoke again. The shrine road wound through a stretch of old-growth oak and beech, and the light came through in columns, amber and green, that made the path feel older and stranger than it was. Oliver watched the undergrowth from long habit, reading sign the way he read text, and after a while he noticed that Ugak did the same, her eyes moving between the shadows in the trees with the steady, patient attention of someone who had been trained to expect threats from unexpected directions. "You move quiet for your size," he said. "You move quiet for a human," she answered, which he took as a compliment of the highest order, even if it had not been intended as one. "What brings you to Harwick?" he asked. He tried to make it conversational rather than interrogative, and she seemed to judge the difference, because she answered instead of going silent. "Lord Harwick sent for a warrior emissary. The Greyveil clans in Harwick's domain have had a truce for 6 years." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There are people on both sides who want it to end." Oliver went still inside, the way he went still when he found an unexpected track in the snow. "I heard something about that," he said carefully. "On the road north, merchants talking, something about the Calvin Pass border posts. 3 of our clan's border guards were found dead at the lower Calvin crossing 2 weeks ago," Ugak said. Her voice was flat. Not emotionless flat in the way that emotion gets compressed into something dense and hard when you cannot afford to let it out. Harwick's crest was marked on a stone above the bodies. 3 cuts, the sign of a deliberate message. Oliver processed this in silence for a moment. He had served Harwick's domain long enough to know the Lord's character: cautious, trade-minded, not a warmonger. Harwick had negotiated the truce himself, had argued for it against his own war council's objections. He did not believe Harwick had ordered the killings, which meant someone else had done it and wanted the blame to land on Harwick's doorstep. "That sounds like someone is trying to restart the war," he said. "Yes," Ugak said, "that is what I am going to Harwick to determine. Alone. Sending a warband would look like an invasion. Sending no one would look like acceptance of the insult." She looked at him sideways. "Sending one warrior emissary sends the message that the Greyveil clans are willing to hear an explanation before they act." "That is a dangerous position," Oliver said quietly. "One emissary alone, on a road full of bandits and people who already don't want the truce to hold." "I am aware," Ugak said. Oliver did not say anything else about it. But he adjusted the way he was scanning the tree line, and his hand stayed closer to his belt knife for the rest of the afternoon. The first wayhouse was at Milford, a cramped, low-beamed building where the keeper was a red-faced man named Gorton who charged, Oliver knew from experience, twice the listed rate for anything he thought he could get away with. Gorton's face did something complicated when they walked in, the fear response that Ugak's presence triggered in most people, followed by a rapid calculation about money and trouble that landed, predictably, on the side of money. "No orc beds," Gorton said, not quite meeting Ugak's eyes. Oliver set both hands flat on the bar. "Then we will take 2 human beds," he said pleasantly. "And you will charge me the rate on your board there, which I can read perfectly well, and we will all have a quiet night." Gorton looked at him. Oliver looked back without any particular aggression, which was somehow more effective than aggression would have been. Gorton found the board suddenly very interesting. 2 beds, he said. "Copper each, supper included." Oliver paid. He did not look at Ugak to see if she had noticed, because making a production of it would have undermined the point. They took their supper at the end of the long common table, which emptied around them with the usual drift, and ate without ceremony. The food was simple, a broth with root vegetables and stringy meat, brown bread that was mostly honest, a jar of something amber that passed for ale in Milford. Ugak ate without apparent self-consciousness, which Oliver found quietly admirable. He had been in towns and wayhouses enough to know how people made her feel the edge of their discomfort, and she had clearly decided years ago that she was not going to perform distress for their comfort. "You have been on the road a long time," he said. Not a question. 3 days from the Greyveil winter camp, she said. "Through the Calvin Narrows before dawn, which you were right about. There are breakbone men in the upper pass. 6 of them." You went through the Narrows alone at dawn with 6 breakbone bandits in the pass. There are 5 breakbone bandits in the pass now, she said, and took a pull of the ale without expression. Oliver looked at her for a moment, then decided that the details were her business and the outcome was impressive either way. I was thinking, he said, about the border guards. Were you? The breakbone company. They operate through the Calvin Narrows. They have enough manpower to hold a pass and enough coin to make it worth holding. That kind of operation needs a backer, someone paying them to stay in that specific location. He turned his ale jar slowly in his hands. The killings at the lower Calvin crossing happened 2 weeks ago. The breakbone men moved into the upper Narrows around the same time. I know because the surveyors I was guiding went that way and ran into them. Ugak had stopped eating. She was looking at him with the sharp, measuring attention of someone reassessing a situation. You are saying whoever ordered the killings also hired the breakbone company, she said slowly. I am saying the timing lines up. And someone who wanted to reignite this war would want to reason dead border guards with Harwick's mark, and then would want to make sure Harwick's answer, whether it was an envoy or a warband, had trouble getting through to actually talk. To prevent the truce from being repaired, Ugak said. To make sure it dies of silence instead of intent, Oliver said. Whoever it is, they don't want you talking to Harwick. A long silence. Outside, the wayhouse fire crackled and someone at the far end of the common room told a joke Oliver didn't catch. That is a careful thought, Ugak said at last. For a huntsman, 11 years in the deep wood, you spend a lot of time thinking. He drank his ale. Lord Harwick is not a warmonger. He built the truce against his own war council. If someone is trying to blame him for those killings, they are either one of his own council or someone outside Harwick's domain who benefits from a war between the clans and the Lord's domain. Ugak looked at her hands, the scarred knuckles, the thick rope of old callus at the base of each finger. The Greyveil clans believe Harwick ordered the killings, she said quietly. My war chief sent me to hear his explanation before committing to response. But the war faction within the clan does not want to wait for an explanation. They want to move. She looked up. I have perhaps 10 days before they stop waiting for my word. Oliver understood the weight of that. 10 days for one woman to walk the rest of this road, get through whatever obstacles had been placed in her way, reach Harwick, sort out the truth of who had ordered the killings, get that truth back to the Greyveil War Council and convince them to hold. 10 days to prevent a war. Then we should sleep now, he said. Because tomorrow I know a cut through the lower Calvin Ridge that shaves a full day off the road and avoids the pass entirely. She looked at him with that unreadable expression again, the one that he was slowly beginning to translate. He thought it might be what trust looked like on a face that had learned to distrust carefully. Why are you helping? She said. Honest answer. I have a contract to collect in Harwick and a war would make that complicated. He paused. Less honest but also true answer. I have been walking this road for 11 years, and I have never once seen anything that was actually improved by a war. He stood and picked up his pack. Also, the food here is terrible and I have dried venison in my pack that is considerably better. Good night, Ugak Strongtusk. He heard, as he climbed the narrow stairs to the upper bunks, the smallest sound. It might have been the settling of the fire. It might have been a suppressed laugh. The cut through the lower Calvin Ridge was exactly what Oliver had promised, a hunter's track, unmarked on any road survey, that wound through a dense stand of spruce and crossed the ridge at a low saddle before dropping into the southern vale. It was not comfortable. The spruce grew close enough that Ugak had to turn sideways in several places and duck under branches that cleared Oliver's head by a foot. She did not complain about this. Oliver noted that she did not complain about anything, which was either impressive self-discipline or genuine ease with discomfort, and based on the way she moved through the rough terrain he suspected it was the latter. They moved through the morning in silence that was comfortable in a way silence between strangers almost never is. Oliver read the forest as he always did, the tilt of a birch trunk, the scatter of needles, the compressed earth of an animal run, and after a while he noticed that Ugak was doing her own reading, a parallel and different kind. She tracked human sign where he tracked animal sign. She noticed broken branches at shoulder height, the scuff of a boot heel in a soft patch, the way smoke hung in the trees 2 ridges over in a way that suggested a camp rather than a farmer's fire. "You are tracking the Breakbone men," he said. "3 scouts on the ridge above us," she said quietly, not breaking stride. "Following from the east, they have been on us since Milford." Oliver processed this without visible alarm. "3," he said. "They will be cautious while we are in the trees. They will want open ground." "There is a meadow clearing half a mile on," Oliver said. "The ridge forces the track into it. There is no going around." "Then we do not run," Ugak said simply. "We choose the moment." Oliver understood the instinct completely. He had hunted enough to know that running from a predator teaches the predator to chase. "How do you want to play it?" he asked, which earned him a brief, startled glance. She had expected, he realized, to simply handle it and had not anticipated being consulted. "You know the ground," she said. "You tell me." "The clearing has a stand of dead elm on the north side. High ground. Good sight lines down to the track," he thought quickly. "If I take the high ground with my bow and you go through the center, they have to choose between you and an archer they can't see. Most men faced with an archer they can't see choose to not find out where he is. And if they are not most men, then I shoot the first one who reaches for a weapon and you handle the other 2. Ugak's expression shifted into something that Oliver would later describe to himself as professional appreciation. "That works," she said. He peeled away into the tree line 100 yards before the clearing, circling wide through the spruce, to find the dead elm stand, and climbed to a position with sight lines across the open ground. He moved in the careful, toe-heel silence of 11 years of this work, getting his breathing settled, and his arrow knocked before Ugak emerged into the meadow clearing below. She crossed it without hurrying. 6 feet and 4 inches of warrior in fitted brown leather, the great axe riding on her back, walking through autumn meadow grass with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided the ground belonged to her. The 3 scouts emerged from the tree line across the clearing, spreading wide, rough men in Breakbone Company colors, the black and ochre that Oliver knew from dealing with their pickets on previous escorts. They fanned out in the arc of people who had done this before and knew how to make it work. Oliver put an arrow into the ground 12 inches in front of the lead scout's left boot. The sound of it striking was sharp and clean and specific. The scout stopped. "The next one finds a knee," Oliver called from the dead elm stand. "Lord Harwick's huntsman. The woman is under his contract. Walk back the way you came." A long, crackling silence. The lead scout looked at his partners. Oliver had another arrow knocked and aimed, and he was, in fact, a very good shot. The scouts reached whatever calculation they reached. They walked back. Ugak did not look toward the elm stand. She did not say anything as Oliver climbed down and caught up to her at the far edge of the clearing. But as they entered the trees again, she said, very quietly, "Good shot." "I was aiming for 6 inches in front of his boot," Oliver said. "I know," she said, which might have been a joke. The road opened below the ridge and they made good time through the afternoon, moving with the comfortable synchronized pace of people who were learning each other's rhythm. The cloud cover that had held all morning broke in the late afternoon, and the light turned gold across the hillside, illuminating a stretch of road lined with the small stone shrine markers that gave Ardenvale's pilgrim route its name, rough-cut blocks of sandstone, each carved with a different symbol, worn smooth by generations of passing hands. Oliver had walked past them 100 times without stopping. He stopped now because Ugak stopped, and he watched her rest one enormous hand briefly on the nearest marker, a carved wave that was the symbol for safe passage with a touch that was not reverent exactly, but was something close to careful. "Your people have shrines," he said. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "Our people mark the places where blood was spilled and the living chose to keep moving," she said. "It is the same thing, only more honest." Oliver considered that. "Fair," he said. They camped that night in a hollow below the road, a sheltered spot Oliver knew from previous transits: good drainage, natural windbreak, hidden from the road by a stand of hawthorn. He built the fire small and clean, the way a huntsman builds fires rather than the way travelers build them, and they ate his dried venison with hardtack and shared water from a stream that came out of the hillside 20 yards north, cold and clean. The fire made the darkness around them feel warm and contained. Ugak sat across from it with her axe across her knees, which was how she always rested. Oliver was beginning to understand the weapon present but relaxed, like an extension of her body that happened to be resting. He was on his side of the fire with his back against a root, and he was aware of the space between them in a way that was not entirely comfortable or entirely uncomfortable. It was charged in a manner he had not quite experienced before, and he was old enough and honest enough to admit to himself that it had something to do with her. "Tell me about Harwick," she said. "Lord or domain?" "Both," he told her. He had been Harwick's huntsman for 11 years, and knew the domain the way he knew the shape of his own hands, its borders and borderlands, its villages and watchtowers, its politics and old grudges. He talked about the Lord himself, a compact, hard man in his 50s who had inherited a domain scarred by the last Orc War, and spent the 2 decades since trying to build something durable enough that his grandchildren would not have to fight the same war. He talked about the truce and how it had been brokered, the 6 years of careful, grudging, often tense cooperation, the trade agreements that had made both sides quietly richer and quietly less willing to throw it all away. "Someone in that council wants the war," Oliver said. "I have suspected it for a while. There is a faction, I do not know their names, only the effects of their maneuvering. Taxes on Orc trade goods that are just high enough to be insulting but not high enough to justify complaint. Border posts moved to positions that create friction. Small things, accumulated over years. Why have you not told Harwick?" "I am a huntsman," Oliver said simply. "My contract is to track animals and escort parties through the deep wood. When I walk into the hall and start telling the Lord that his council is sabotaging his truce, I am a huntsman with a theory and a lot of enemies." He fed a small stick to the fire. "Also, I had nothing solid, nothing that would stand up in a hall full of men who are much better at talking than I am." Ugak watched him across the fire. The amber of her eyes caught the light in a way that made them look like something burning from inside. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A man who would move out of my path," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor and not quite vulnerability, but lived somewhere between the two. "I noticed you expecting that," Oliver said. He held her gaze, which was not easy, not because of any fear, but because there was so much in her gaze that it took effort to hold the contact. "I decided not to give it to you." "Why?" He thought about how to say it honestly. "Because I have been the thing people walk around my whole life," he said. "I know what it costs. I did not want to do it to you." The fire settled. Sparks rose and died. The night insects were quiet this late in the autumn, and the only sound was the small voice of the nearby stream. "Oliver Walker," Ugak said at last, like she was testing the weight of the name. "Ugak Strongtusk," he said back the same way. Something eased between them. Not fully, not all at once, but the way ice eases in early spring, a hairline crack, a slight give, the sense of something that had been very hard beginning to consider becoming soft. She slept with her axe. He slept with his back to a tree and his bow across his chest, and when he woke twice in the night to listen to the darkness, he saw each time that she was awake too, watching the same darkness from the other side, and neither of them said anything about it. The Way House at Corval's Fork was better than Milford, kept by a round, practical woman named Sierra, who had been managing Way House stops for 30 years, and had developed the specific kind of mercantile pragmatism that recognizes a paying customer regardless of what they look like. She gave them beds without commentary, fed them a meal that actually had flavor, and told them over the after-supper fire that there had been a company of soldiers through 2 days ago, wearing Harwick colors but riding hard and without a contract paper, which was unusual. "Whose soldiers?" Oliver asked. "They had Harwick's colors but not Harwick's crest on their chest plates," Sira said. She had the manner of someone who had observed a great deal and drawn careful conclusions. "The crest is always on the chest plate for official business. The chest plates were blank." Ugak and Oliver exchanged a look across the fire. "Blank chest plates are mercenaries or private retainers wearing borrowed colors," Oliver said. "Someone is moving men on this road in Harwick's name without his sanction." "They asked about road conditions to the north," Sira said. "Specifically about whether any large orc parties had come through." Ugak's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They are watching for me," she said. "Not just watching," Oliver said. "Moving. They are trying to intercept you before you reach Harwick. To prevent me from delivering the Greyveil Clan's message," Ugak said. Sira, who was not a woman who panicked, looked between them with calm, sharp eyes. "Whatever you are walking into," she said, "you might want to not walk directly into it. There is a back way into Harwick's town through the Miller's Quarter up the Ash Lane, comes in behind the Hall stables. It is not on any road map. My husband's family used to deliver grain that way." "Is your husband available to explain it in detail?" Oliver asked. "My husband has been dead 7 years, Sira said, without notable grief. It had clearly been long enough to become fact rather than wound. But I can draw you a map." She did, on the back of a bread wrapper in charcoal, with the practiced hand of someone who had memorized the route from decades of hearing it described. Oliver studied it until he had it in his head. Ugak studied it beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her arm, close enough that her braided hair swung forward and almost touched his shoulder when she leaned in to trace a detail of the route with one finger. He was very aware of how close she was. He was, in fact, entirely too aware of it, and he spent the rest of the evening being scrupulously normal about it. They left Corval's Fork before dawn. The back route Sira had drawn took them west of the main road, through farmland that was already stripped for autumn, the fields gray and empty in the early light, the farmhouses shuttered and dark. They moved fast. Oliver had the map in his head and read the landscape against it, with the same automatic competence he brought to reading the deep wood, and Ugak matched his pace without complaint. He was beginning to understand her economy, the way she used words and energy only when they were needed, the way she was always reading the world around her without making a performance of it, the way her silences were not uncomfortable, but rather occupied, full of the steady quiet of someone who was entirely at home in their own skin. He found it, against all expectation, deeply restful. He had spent a great deal of his life in the company of people who needed the silence filled, and being with someone who did not was a kind of relief he had not realized he was missing. They were crossing the edge of a fallow field, 3 miles from Harwick's town, when Oliver heard the horses. He grabbed Ugak's arm. She allowed it, which told him that she trusted the touch even if she had not consciously decided to, and pulled them both flat into the remnant of a drainage ditch along the field's edge, half submerged in cold mud and dead grass. 4 riders came across the field from the east, moving at a trot, scanning the landscape with the purposeful attention of men who were looking for something specific. They wore Harwick's colors with blank chest plates. Ugak and Oliver lay absolutely still. Oliver controlled his breathing and watched through the dead grass, counting men and weapons and reading body language. The riders swept close within 40 yards and then curved away south, missing the ditch, moving on. When they were gone, Oliver and Ugak lay still for another count of 60. The mud was very cold. The dead grass smelled of rain and iron. He was aware that his shoulder was pressed against hers and that neither of them had shifted away from it. 4 riders, he murmured, looking in the wrong direction. We go now fast. Yes, she said. They came up from the ditch and ran. Not the panicked sprint of people who are frightened, but the controlled, covering run of people who have decided that speed is the best tactic and are executing it without wasted motion. Oliver ran with the loping efficiency of a man who spent his working life moving through rough terrain, and Ugak ran beside him in a way that made him feel, absurdly, that she could have run twice as fast if she had not been pacing him. She was built for this in a way that he was not. Those long legs ate the ground in strides that should have left him behind, but she held his speed exactly, and he chose not to examine the feeling that gave him too closely. They came through the miller's quarter at a walk, breathing hard, covered in field mud. The back lanes were quiet and narrow, the ash lane exactly where Sierra's map said it would be, a cobbled alley between old stone buildings that smelled of grain and horse. The hall stables were at the end of it, and behind the stables, a side door into the outer hall court that was guarded by a single gate warden. Oliver went to the gate warden first. He knew the man, an old soldier named Bart who had worked Harwick's gates since before Oliver's contract. "I need to see the Lord," Oliver said. "Private, now, with my companion." Bart looked at Ugak with the slow, careful expression of a man who had learned not to let his face say too many things. "She is with you." "She is the reason I need to see him," Oliver said. Bart thought about it for approximately 5 seconds, which was 5 seconds less than most men would have needed. "Come through," he said, and opened the door. Lord Harwick received them in his private study, which was small and cluttered with maps and trade documents and smelled powerfully of tallow candles and old leather. He was a compact, gray-bearded man in his mid-50s with the specific watchfulness of someone who had spent decades making decisions that cost people their lives. He looked at Ugak with surprise, then at Oliver, then back to Ugak. "Ugak Strongtusk," he said. "Greyveil Clans." "Lord Harwick," she said. "Your name is written on a stone above 3 dead Greyveil warriors. I have come for your explanation." Harwick sat down heavily. "I did not order those killings," he said. "I would not." "Then who did?" Oliver stepped forward before Harwick could answer. "There are men riding your colors on the road," he said. "Blank chest plates. They are trying to intercept her. They have been moving since at least Corval's Fork, 2 days south. Someone in this hall is running private retainers in your name and does not want this conversation to happen." Harwick looked at Oliver with the expression of a man whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed. "Aldrin," he said, almost to himself. "Your war council chief," Oliver said. "He has been arguing for abrogation of the truce since the first year. Said the clan territories were too rich to leave to the clans." Harwick's voice was tired in the way of a man who has been fighting this particular battle for a very long time. "I had no proof he was taking action. I had only his argument." "You have my testimony about the riders," Oliver said. "And Ugak Strongtusk's testimony about the border guards, which, if it matches any physical evidence, Aldrin cannot explain away." "The stone," Ugak said quietly. "The one above our dead, it was freshly cut. The carving of your crest, it was done by someone who was not familiar with the symbol. There is a second stroke on the lower left arm of the cross that your actual seal does not have. I noticed it before I left camp." She reached into her belt pouch and produced a rubbing, a piece of cloth pressed against the carved stone, capturing the image in charcoal. She laid it on Harwick's desk beside his official seal ring. The difference was visible. It was small, but it was there, a second stroke that a foreign hand had added because it had been working from memory or a described copy rather than the actual seal. Harwick studied it. His jaw was set. "Aldrin would have seen my seal enough times to describe it," he said, "but he is not a craftsman. He would describe it to someone who carved it, and that someone might add a stroke from their own visual imagination." He looked up. "This is enough for a hall inquiry. It is not yet enough for a conviction." "Where is Aldrin now?" Oliver asked. "He rode out this morning," Harwick said slowly, "unannounced, saying he had business at the Colvin border post." The 3 of them let that sit. "He knows I am coming," Ugak said. "He must have had word that I left Greyveil camp. He sends riders to intercept me on the road, and when that fails, he goes to the border himself." "To do what?" "To create another incident," Oliver said. "Something larger, something that cannot be undone by one emissary arriving with a cloth rubbing." Harwick was already on his feet. I will send my sworn guard. Aldrin has private retainers in your colors on the road, Oliver said. If your sworn guard rides in Harwick colors, he cannot tell your men from Aldrin's men until it is too late. He was thinking fast, the same calculation he used when hunting, read the ground, pick the path, commit. Let me go, I know the road. I know where he will go. The lower Calvin crossing is where the killings happened, and that is where he will go to finish what he started, with enough men and a big enough action that it cannot be explained away. You are a huntsman, Harwick said. I have been more than a huntsman on this particular errand, Oliver said. He looked at Ugak. I am going, she said flatly. It was not a question or a negotiation. Harwick looked between them. He was not a man who spent long on decisions once he had the information he needed. Take Bart and 4 sworn men in unmarked colors, he said. Get to the lower Calvin crossing before Aldrin does whatever he plans to do there. Do not kill him if you can help it. I need him to answer in a hall, not die in a field. He paused. Oliver, your contract is extended, triple the previous rate. I appreciate that, Oliver said. They rode out within the hour, Oliver, Ugak, Bart, and 4 of Harwick's most trusted sworn men in plain traveling coats. Oliver knew a fast line to the lower Calvin crossing that cut through Harwick's hunting preserve. A private shortcut he had never shown anyone, not even the surveyors, because it was his in the way that hunters come to feel ownership of the ground they know best. They rode hard. Ugak rode as she did everything else with calm, total competence, her axe strapped across her back, her braid loose from the riding and streaming behind her. Oliver rode beside her and felt, in a way that was not comfortable to examine while riding fast through autumn forest, that this was a natural arrangement, the two of them at the front of a column moving towards something dangerous together. They came down the last ridge above the lower Calvin crossing an hour before noon and reined in behind a screen of willow scrub to look at what was below. Aldrin was already there. He was a tall man in an expensive coat, silver at the temples, with the bearing of someone who had spent his career being the most important person in any room. He had 10 men with him, and they had 4 orc herders in irons, not warriors, herders, farmers, 2 of them elderly. From the Greyveil Clan, judging by their belt markings. They had clearly been seized in the fields. He is going to kill them, Ugak said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. Her knuckles on the reins were not. He is going to kill 4 clan farmers and mark this crossing again. And he is going to make it large enough to pull my warchief across the border with a war band before anyone can explain anything. No, Oliver said. He turned to Bart. Take the men east, come around behind his position from the river bank. Do it quietly. Do not move until you hear my voice. Bart, who was a professional soldier and knew when to trust the man who knew the ground, nodded and peeled away with the 4 sworn men. You and I go down, Oliver said to Ugak. That is 10 men, she said. I know. Against 2 of us. If we do it right, it is 1 man and his honor, Oliver said. Public, in the open. With his own testimony audible to his own people, he looked at her. You understand what I mean, she looked at him steadily. You want to make him declare himself. He is betting that no one stops him before he acts. He does not know we know about him. If we arrive before he acts, openly, in front of his own men, he has to either stand down or commit to treason in front of witnesses. Ugak was already reading the ground below, the positions, the space. His men are retainers, she said. Paid men. Aldrin is their coin but not their sworn lord. If he commands them to act openly against Harwick's huntsman and a diplomatic emissary, some of them will not follow. Exactly. They rode down the slope in plain sight, unhurried, letting the sound of their horses' hooves announce them on the stony ground. Aldrin turned. His expression moved through surprise, calculation, and settled on something cold and committed. Walker, he said, you are a long way from the wood. I am where my contract takes me, Oliver said. He halted his horse 20 feet from Aldrin's group and did not dismount. I see you have 4 Greyveil civilians in irons. What is the warrant for that? Border violation, Aldrin said. Trespassing in Harwick's domain. Those field markers are 6 feet inside Greyveil territory, Ugak said from her horse. Her voice carried across the open crossing with the natural carrying power of someone who had spent years commanding. I know this ground. I walked it 2 days ago. You seized these people on their own land. Aldrin's 10 men were looking at each other and at her and at Oliver. You have no authority here, Aldrin said to Oliver. You are a huntsman. Lord Harwick extended my contract this morning, Oliver said. I am currently his representative on this road. You may consider that statement legally binding. He kept his voice level and his eyes on Aldrin's face. Put down the irons, Aldrin. You are under inquiry for the killings at this crossing 2 weeks ago. Lord Harwick is prepared to hear your explanation in hall, with full process. This is the moment where you choose what happens next. Aldrin's face did something very specific, the calculation of a man who has committed too far to back down and knows it, the decision that makes desperate men do terrible things. His hand went to his sword. What happened next was the kind of moment that Oliver would remember for the rest of his life in the specific, slow detail that extreme danger produces. Aldrin's sword cleared its scabbard and came up toward Ugak, who was the closest and largest threat. One of his men on the left raised a crossbow. The crossbow was aimed at Ugak from a range of 15 feet, the kind of shot that finds its mark regardless of armor. Oliver moved his horse directly between the crossbow and Ugak. He did not consciously decide to do this. His body moved before the decision was fully formed, some animal equation of value and expenditure that resolved faster than thought. He put himself between the bolt and the woman and said very clearly to Aldrin's man with the crossbow, "If you loose that, Harwick will hang you. I am his named representative. Think." The man with the crossbow was not Aldrin. He was a hired retainer with a family and a paycheck, and Oliver's voice held something that cut through the adrenaline, the absolute flat certainty of someone who was not bluffing. Bart and the 4 sworn men came up from the riverbank, swords drawn. 10 men became 8 men against 5 sworn guards plus 2 people who were, in this moment, very close to the center of the road with a great deal of determination. Ugak had her axe in her hand. She had cleared it from her back in the moment the crossbow went up, and she had not moved from behind Oliver's horse, which meant she was processing the same fact he was, that if she moved, the crossbow man's nerve might break in the wrong direction. She was holding still because he had put himself in the line of fire and she was not going to waste that. "This is over," Oliver said to Aldrin. "Lord Harwick knows. His sworn men are here. Your men are hired, not sworn. They will not die for a plot against their lord's charter. Put the sword down." Aldrin's sword trembled. His face was the face of a man watching something he had spent years building collapse in the space of one conversation. And then, in the particular cowardice of men who have miscalculated badly, his nerve broke. He lowered the sword. His men lowered their weapons one by one, the crossbow last, and the bolt was not loosened. Bart and his men moved in with the efficiency of professionals who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The irons were transferred from the 4 Greyveil civilians to Aldrin and 2 of his closest men. The rest were disarmed and told to ride back to Harwick's town, which they did with visible relief. Oliver did not move his horse from the position he had taken between the crossbow and Ugak until the crossbow was on the ground, and the man who had held it was 30 yards away. Then he exhaled slowly and turned his horse to face her. Ugak was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, and he had seen a fair range of her expressions over the past 3 days. This was something unguarded, something that had come up from underneath the iron of her composure and not yet been pressed back down. Her eyes were very bright. "You put yourself between me and a crossbow bolt," she said. "He could have missed," Oliver said, which was a transparent deflection, and they both knew it. Oliver, his name in her voice without the qualifier of his last name, without the measured distance she had kept between them, landed differently than it ever had. "You put your body between me and a bolt." He looked at her. She was sitting on her horse 6 feet from him, her axe across her saddle, the autumn light making the angles of her face into something that he could not look away from. "Yes," he said, "I did." "Why?" He thought about the careful, safe answers and discarded them. "Because you matter more than the bolt," he said. "Because I have been walking this road with you for 3 days, and I have not found the edge of you yet, and I intend to keep looking for a while." Something happened in her face. The iron composure did not break. It had been too well built, over too many years, to break from a few words, but it opened. The way a door that has been locked for a long time opens when someone who knows which key to use turns it. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the 4 Greyveil farmers who had been in irons stood 20 feet away, trying very hard not to watch. Ugak reached across the space between their horses and put her hand against the side of his face. Her palm was warm and calloused and careful, the way she had been careful with his hand that first morning on the pilgrim road. Her thumb traced a line along his jaw, and she looked at him the way she had looked at the shrine marker on the road, not quite reverence, but something close to careful, as if he were something she did not want to break. Oliver turned his face into her palm. "Oliver Walker," she said softly, "you are very strange." "So I have been told," he agreed. She almost smiled. It was the closest she had come to it in 3 days, and it transformed her face into something extraordinary. Not softened, exactly, but lit from inside like a fire behind amber glass. She lowered her hand. They both turned back to the practical work of the moment. Bart and the sworn men had Aldrin secured, and the Greyveil farmers freed, and there was a great deal of organizing to be done. But Oliver kept the warmth of her hand against his face for the rest of that afternoon, tucked away somewhere inside his chest where it would keep. They rode back to Harwick's town together, Aldrin in custody, the Greyveil farmers given horses from the seized retainers' mounts, the sworn men in the practical, businesslike mood of soldiers who have executed a mission cleanly. Ugak rode beside Oliver and said little, which was not unusual, but the quality of her silence had shifted in the way that charges itself under the surface. Lord Harwick conducted the inquiry that evening, which was swift and pointed in the manner of a lord who is deeply, personally furious, but has the discipline not to let it show as anything other than deliberate process. Aldrin was confronted with the cloth rubbing, with Oliver's testimony, with the 4 Greyveil civilians who identified him by name, and with 3 of his own retainers who turned witness in exchange for clemency. The case took 2 hours to build and approximately 4 minutes to become inescapable. Aldrin was stripped of his counsel seat and placed under formal arrest pending a higher court's judgment. The 2 retainers who had been closest to the killings at the crossing were held with him. Harwick announced formally, with the Greyveil emissary present, that the killings had not been carried out by his command, that the evidence of a rogue council member's private action was documented, and that he requested, on behalf of his domain, that the truce be reaffirmed. Ugak stood in Harwick's hall and heard all of this and said, at the end, in the carrying voice of a formal emissary, "The Greyveil clans will hear this accounting. I will carry it back with the evidence and counsel my warchief to hold." She paused. "The truce must be strengthened, not simply reaffirmed. There must be a process for investigating violations before they become incidents." "I agree," Harwick said. "Will you stay to help draft it?" Ugak looked at Harwick. Then she looked at Oliver, who was standing to Harwick's right in the hall, and she held his gaze for the span of 3 breaths. "A few days," she said. "I will stay a few days." The hall work took 4 days. Oliver had no official role in the truce drafting, but he was present because Ugak found him useful in the practical, grounded way that she found all things useful. His knowledge of the road and the crossing points informed several of the proposed protocols, in ways that the formal council members would not have arrived at on their own. He sat at the side of the hall chamber and listened and occasionally said something, and Ugak occasionally looked at him across the table, and they had entire conversations in those glances that had nothing to do with truce protocols. On the 3rd evening of the drafting, After the formal session ended and the council members and Harwick's secretaries had filed out, Ugak remained at the table. Oliver was the last other person in the room. He had stayed behind to return a set of road maps to the shelving along the hall wall, which was unnecessary because a secretary would have done it, but he had not been ready to leave the room. She knew he had stayed unnecessarily. He knew she knew. He put the maps away and turned around, and she was standing a foot behind him, close in the way she very rarely allowed herself to be close to anyone, the great axe left against the wall rather than carried. This close she was enormous. He had to tilt his head back slightly to meet her eyes, and the height difference between them was significant enough to be almost absurd. He did not find it absurd. "The draft is good," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I leave tomorrow. I need to get the accounting back to the war chief before the 10 days are up." "I know." Her hands were at her sides. He could see her deciding something, could see the deliberation in the slight shift of her weight, the way she looked at him with the measuring attention she gave to things she was about to commit to. "You said on the road," she said carefully, "that you had not found the edge of me. I remember saying that." "I've not found the edge of you either," she said. "I did not expect to not find the edge of you. Most people are easy to see the edge of." "Is that your way of saying you would like to keep looking?" Oliver asked. The almost smile that he had seen twice now, that extraordinary thing that lit her from the inside, came up in her face. "I am a Greyveil Clan warrior," she said. "I do not have roots in any one place. I move where I am needed." "I am a huntsman," he said. "My contract is to follow the work." "Then perhaps our roads will cross again," she said. "Or perhaps one of us could make it a point for the roads to cross," he said, "rather than leaving it to chance." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand deliberately, not the brief, careful handshake of the Pilgrim Road, but a full clasp, her enormous scarred fingers wrapped around his with a warmth that was entirely intentional. "My war chief's camp is in the Greyveil winter grounds," she said. "After I deliver this accounting, I will have leave to travel." She paused. "Harwick's domain borders the Greyveil territory at the Calvin crossing. That is not far." "It is not far," Oliver agreed. She stepped forward, closing the last foot of distance between them, and kissed him. It was deliberate and full and warm, the way she did everything without hesitation, without apology, entirely committed once committed. Oliver kissed her back with everything he had, which was, he realized in the moment, considerably more than he had known he was capable of. She tasted of fire and river and something dark and sweet, and her hands came up to hold his face the way she had held it at the Calvin crossing, with that extraordinary careful warmth, as if he were something she was choosing not to break. When they separated, they were both breathing a little faster than was strictly explained by the activity. "I will be at the Calvin crossing in 3 weeks, she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, which he found enormously impressive. "I will be there," he said. His voice was slightly less perfectly steady, which he suspected she found something. She gathered her axe from the wall and walked out of the hall chamber, and Oliver stood in the empty room for a moment, looking at the space where she had been, and felt the particular overwhelming quality of a feeling that is too large for the container you have been living in. He went back to his quarters in the hall's guest wing and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands for a while. 3 weeks. He was not a patient man by nature, but 11 years of hunting had taught him that patience was not about comfort. It was about holding the right position until the moment came. He could hold. He was at the Calvin crossing in 18 days, not 3 weeks, because there was work in that direction, and because he was, in fact, not as patient as he told himself. He told himself the work was the reason, and the work was there, and it was real, but it was not the whole reason. He set up a camp at the lower Calvin crossing, a proper camp, not a rough overnight spot, with a lean-to of fresh spruce poles and a fire ring lined with flat stones, because it had occurred to him that if she arrived and he had nothing to offer but an open field, it would be a poor showing. He hunted in the Calvin Valley for 3 days, took a good deer, smoked the meat at the camp, caught fish in the crossing pool, gathered the late autumn roots he knew where to find, and built a camp that was not grand but was deliberately, specifically good. On the fourth day, he heard her coming from half a mile out, not because she was loud but because he had been listening for her, and he had learned over the past weeks how she moved, the slight distinctive scuff of iron-capped boot toes on stone, the particular rhythm of her step. She came down the slope above the crossing in the late afternoon light with her axe on her back and her braids swinging, and she stopped at the edge of the camp and looked at it, then looked at him. "You built a camp," she said. "You are coming a long way," he said. "You have been here 4 days," she said. She had read the camp age with the same skill he read tracks. 3, he said. 4, she said, and she was right. He handed her a cup of the hot broth he had been keeping on the fire, and she took it in both hands and stood in his camp and looked around at it with that careful expression of someone reading something that is being said without words. "The war chief accepted the accounting," she said. "The war faction argued, but the cloth rubbing was too specific and the testimony from Harwick's own people was too documented. The truce holds." She drank from the cup. "There will be a formal renewal ceremony at the Calvin crossing in the spring. Harwick will send representatives. My war chief will attend in person." "That is good," Oliver said. "It is very good," she agreed. "And after the ceremony?" he asked. "After the ceremony," she said, "I have no fixed posting. My war chief gave me leave of assignment." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Indefinite." Oliver let that land. "There is work in Harwick's domain," he said. "The hunting preserve needs new survey trails mapped. The border country is not well charted. Harwick has been asking me for years to extend my work into the Calvin Valley." He paused. "It is work for 2 people who know how to move in rough country." "Is it?" she said. "I believe it would qualify as a contract if you were interested." "A contract," she said. "Yes." She set the cup down on the fire-ring stone and looked at him the way she had looked at him that first moment on the Pilgrim Road, measuring, reading, finding something that did not fit the categories she had built. Except now he recognized what was in her face, because he had seen it open further and further over the past weeks, until it had become legible to him in a way that nothing had ever been quite so legible before. It was the look of someone who has found the thing they had stopped believing they would find, and is not entirely sure yet how to be that lucky. He crossed the camp and stood in front of her. The height difference was the same as it had always been. She was 12 inches taller and built to a different scale, and he was exactly himself, ordinary and real in every dimension. She looked down at him and he looked up at her, and he took her hands in his, both of them those great scarred warrior's hands, and held them. "I do not care about the contract," he said. "I care about you being here." "I know," she said quietly. "I want you here," he said. "Not because of what you can do in rough country, because of how it feels to be in the world with you." He felt the truth of it as he said it, the specific ache of it. "Because you are the first person in 11 years of my own company who made me feel like my company was actually better with someone in it." Ugak Strongtusk, who had survived wars and crossings and bandits and the Breakbone Company, and 11 years of her own isolation among people who stepped away from her, who held herself together with the iron discipline of someone who had decided long ago that needing things was a vulnerability, reached forward and pulled him against her with a gentleness that was the most powerful thing about it. One arm wrapping around him in the enveloping certainty of someone who had decided, all the way down, to stop holding back. He held her back. He put his arms around the enormous warrior broad width of her and pressed his face against the warm leather of her bodice and held on. And they stood in the camp in the late afternoon light at the Calvin crossing for a long time without saying anything, which was, Oliver thought, its own complete language. She stayed. Not forever settled, because she was not a woman built for permanent stillness. But she stayed in the way that mattered, the way that means the other person is the place you return to even when you move. They worked the Calvin Valley through the winter months, mapping the border country in detail that would eventually become the foundation for new trade route agreements. Oliver hunted and tracked and read the landscape, and Ugak guarded their routes through terrain where even seasoned travelers sometimes did not return, and they built something between them that had the specific, hard-won quality of things constructed in difficult conditions. Not fragile, not theoretical, not dependent on everything being easy. The winter camp they made in the Calvin Valley was small and practical, because they were both practical people, a log-and bark shelter built against a granite outcrop that retained heat, deep inside the spruce on the eastern bank, sheltered from the worst of the valley wind. Oliver had the shelter-building skills, and Ugak had the raw strength and the engineering instinct, and what they built together was better than what either could have built alone, which seemed to both of them like the appropriate symbol for everything. The winter was hard in the honest, grinding way of hard winter's cold that got into the bones and stayed, game that went sparse in the deep months, a storm in the third week of winter that buried the valley entrance for 6 days, and required them to spend those 6 days entirely within the radius of the camp. Oliver would not have characterized any of those 6 days as a hardship. He would have characterized them as the best 6 consecutive days of his adult life, which was a statement he kept to himself for approximately 2 of those days before he gave up keeping it to himself and said it out loud. All 6, Ugak said. She was sitting against the shelter wall mending one of the axe's leather wraps which had been rubbing, and she did not look up from the work. All 6, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said then, which covered everything. There were moments in those months that Oliver would remember with the specific tactile quality of memories that are so real they leave an impression in the body. The morning she came back to camp with a fresh elk over her shoulders, and dropped it with a look of complete satisfaction, and found him already laying out the tools needed to dress it, so that they worked the whole process together in the easy silence of people whose hands have learned each other. The evening she showed him, without preamble or explanation, the clan bracelet she had kept on her left wrist since her warriors, marking a worked copper band with the Greyveil Clan's warthorn pattern, and traced the symbol with one finger and said, "In clan custom, a warrior gives a token of this kind to the person they have chosen. The giving is the declaration," and then looked at him very steadily. Oliver had looked at the bracelet, and at her, and understood what she was telling him. He reached up and unclasped the cord from his own wrist, the only piece of ornamentation he wore, a simple hunter's tracking cord he had carried since his first year in Harwick's employ, worn smooth and warm from 11 years against his skin. He held it out to her. Ugak looked at it in his hand for a moment. Then she took it, and she tied it around her own wrist beside the copper band, a thin cord next to the heavy work of clan metal, which was perhaps the most accurate representation of them that either could have constructed. She pulled him close by the front of his coat and kissed him in the camp's firelight with the same full, deliberate warmth as the first time in Harwick's hall, except longer and deeper, and with the specific quality of something that is not a beginning but a middle, the part where the uncertainty has been resolved and what remains is entirely, warmly chosen. Spring came slowly to the Calvin Valley, announced first by the creek running faster and louder under its ice lid, then by the first birds, and finally by the mud that made the border trails a misery to navigate for 2 weeks before the ground firmed up. Oliver and Ugak emerged from the valley with 3 months of detailed survey maps and a working relationship that had become so integrated that Harwick's other staff, watching them work in the spring courtyard, had the disconcerting sense of watching 2 people who had developed their own functional language. The formal truce renewal ceremony was scheduled for the vernal equinox, at the lower Calvin crossing where Aldrin had been arrested the previous autumn. Harwick attended in person with his full council, a new war council chief, a careful woman named Dava who had argued for the truce since the beginning. The Greyveil war chief attended with an honor guard of 12 warriors, and Ugak attended as part of the honor guard, which was her formal role, and also as the Greyveil emissary who had brokered the original crisis resolution, which was her historical role, and also, in a way that was not publicly formal but was not remotely secret, as the person who stood next to Oliver Walker through the entire ceremony with a hunter's tracking cord on her wrist. People noticed. Of course people noticed. Several members of Harwick's council noticed in the specific way of people who have opinions about what is and is not appropriate, and those opinions were visible on their faces during the ceremony in the way that opinions often leak out around the edges of formal occasions when people think no one is watching. One of them, a newly appointed trade council member named Barrick, flushed and self-important in his formal coat, said something afterward, in the open-air gathering that followed the signing of the renewed truce, loud enough to be heard by the people around him. Something about the impropriety of a lord's huntsman conducting himself in a way that compromised Harwick's diplomatic relationships, with a specific nod toward Ugak that was not disguised as anything other than what it was. Oliver heard it. He had very good hearing, honed by 11 years of listening to a forest. He turned from the conversation he was having with Bart, excused himself, and walked directly to where Barrick was standing with 3 other council members at the edge of the gathering, in full view of both the Harwick contingent and the Greyveil honor guard. "Barrick," he said pleasantly. Barrick looked at him with the expression of a man who had not expected to be addressed directly and had not prepared a response for it. "Walker," he said. "I heard what you said," Oliver said, "about compromise." He was very calm, which was, in his experience, more effective than anger. "For your information, the survey maps of the Colvin Border Valley that I and my companion produced this winter are the most detailed geographic record this domain has had of that territory in 40 years. Those maps are the foundation of 3 of the 6 protocols in the document that was just signed. That document, which Harwick himself authorized and participated in creating, prevents a war that would cost this domain more men and coin than you will see in your career." He paused. "I would appreciate it if you kept your opinions about my personal life to your own council and out of this gathering." Barrick was red in the face and had nothing to say, because all of it was accurate and checkable, and he was standing in the open with people on both sides listening. Oliver turned back to the gathering. Ugak was standing 15 feet away, and she had heard every word, because she had very good hearing too, and she had been watching him since he walked away. Her amber eyes held that interior light, the open, lit quality that he had come to understand was the face she kept for him, the face she had kept for no one else in a very long time. She crossed the space between them. The Greyveil honor guard watched. The Harwick council watched. Barrick watched. The warchief watched, with the particular expression of a man who had heard the full accounting of his emissary's journey and understood, with complete clarity, what had been built between these 2 people over the past months. Ugak stopped in front of Oliver. She was in her warrior's leathers, the same fitted brown bodice and riding trousers and iron-capped boots she had worn on the pilgrim road, the pauldron and its strap clean and polished for the formal occasion. The copper band and the hunting cord were both on her wrist. The morning light made her tusks gleam and the green of her skin warm and her amber eyes very bright. She put her hand on his jaw, the way she had at the Colvin crossing on the day he had put himself between her and a crossbow bolt, with the same extraordinary careful warmth. And then, in front of Harwick and Barrick and the full Greyveil honor guard and the warchief and Bart and Sira from Corval's Fork Way House, who had been invited to the ceremony because Harwick had heard the full story and felt she deserved to see the ending, Ugak Strongtusk kissed Oliver Walker. Not briefly, not apologetically. Fully and deliberately, and without any performance of it beyond the honest fact of it. She kissed him the way she had kissed him in the hall and the camp and every time in between, with the complete commitment of someone who has decided all the way down and does not intend to undecide. He kissed her back the same way. Around them, the reaction divided cleanly. Harwick made a brief, satisfied sound and turned back to his trade papers. Dava raised one eyebrow and wrote something in her notes. Bart grinned widely. Sira made a warm, pleased noise that carried across the gathering. Beric looked as if he had bitten something sour and would like to say something about it, but was very clearly outnumbered by the quality and rank of the people present who clearly disagreed. The war chief said nothing, but the expression on his weathered face was the expression of a man who has gambled on a decision and watched it return better than he hoped. The Greyveil honor guard, for their part, responded with the particular restrained approval that warriors extend to demonstrations of commitment, a collective shift in posture, a straightening, the subtle visible relaxation of people who have assessed a situation and found it sound. When Oliver and Ugak separated, both breathing slightly faster than was strictly required, he looked at her and she looked at him, and he said, very quietly, just for her, "I told you I had not found the edge of you." "You have had several months," she said, equally quiet, "and I still have not found it," he said, "so I propose to keep looking." "You are a thorough man," she said. "In my defense, the territory is extensive," he said. She almost laughed. He was becoming, over these months, a collector of her almost laughs, which were rarer and therefore more valuable than other people's full laughs. This one was close, the closest yet. Her shoulders moved. The almost smile reached her eyes and stayed there. "Oliver Walker," she said. "Ugak Strongtusk," he said. "The Calvin Valley needs another month of survey work on the northern tributary," she said, "according to your own maps." "It does," he agreed. "I will be available for that work," she said. "As will I," he said. She took his hand, that careful, deliberate clasp of her enormous scarred fingers around his, and they turned together back to the gathering, where the truce documents were being witnessed, and the spring food was being laid out, and the two peoples who had been kept at war for a generation were, awkwardly and carefully and with numerous small moments of friction that would have to be worked through, beginning to eat together. Oliver looked out over the Calvin crossing, the flat gray stones of the ford, the willows greening at the banks, the hills beyond rolling north into the territory where he had hunted for 11 years, and felt the specific, grounded quality of someone who has found the place they are supposed to be. Not a physical place, or not only a physical place. The place of standing next to someone who sees you entirely, and chooses you entirely, and does not intend to stop. Ugak's hand was warm in his. The hunting cord was on her wrist beside the clan copper. Her axe was on her back and his bow was on his, and the road south was open, and the valley north was mapped, and the truce that someone had tried to burn to the ground was signed and witnessed and real, and they were standing in the middle of the crossing in the spring light with nowhere else they needed to be. The Greyveil warchief paused beside them on his way to the food tables, a big gray-templed warrior with the same amber eyes that Ugak had, and he looked at Oliver with the measuring regard of a man who has heard a great deal about another man, and is now forming his own opinion at close range. "She tells me," the warchief said to Oliver, "that you were the only man on the pilgrim road who did not step out of her path." "I was," Oliver said. The warchief looked at him for a moment longer, reading whatever he was reading. Then he nodded once, slow, with the specific weight of someone who has authority and chooses to deploy it as recognition rather than judgment. "Good," said the warchief and walked on. Ugak squeezed Oliver's hand once briefly, which in her economy of expression was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. He squeezed back. Around them, the spring gathered itself along the banks of the Calvin, and the willows put out new green, and the two peoples ate together in the open air, and the road that had brought them here stretched south into the wider world full of the ordinary and extraordinary things that two people who have found each other might yet do in it. Oliver Walker, huntsman, had spent 11 years believing the deep wood was where he belonged, that the solitude of it was not loneliness but preference, that the edges of rooms and conversations were where someone like him was naturally situated. He understood, standing at this crossing with the sun on his face and Ugak Strongtusk's hand in his, that he had been wrong about that for a very long time. He had not belonged to the solitude. He had been waiting in it. And she, who had walked every road she had ever walked with the crowd parting before her, who had spent years being the thing people moved around rather than toward, who had built her iron composure out of the specific material of not being chosen. She looked at him now with her amber eyes open, and her face lit from the inside and her enormous scarred hand holding his, and was, for the first time in longer than she could easily count, not alone. The truce was signed. The valley was mapped. The road was theirs. They went north together into the open country, and the Calvin sang over its stones, and whatever came next, they went toward it side by side,